Hey there, and thank you for making the Parable Podcast a part of your day. I'm Danielle Zapchenk. Today I was able to talk with Southern fiction author and speaker Julane Fisher. Julane shares about a time where she desperately wondered how to make sense of God's plan.
We really don't know what God has for us. We don't know the plan. If we give up, we will never know. So don't give up. No matter on what your dream is or what you think is happening, keep on trying because there may be something really great right around the corner.
Here's my conversation with Julane Fisher. Well, Julane Fisher, welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. We met a couple months back in, is it your home state of Georgia? Is that right?
Yes. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You are a speaker, author, and blogger. So living in Georgia, if I was in your hometown, what would be the first thing that you would take me to?
Well, everybody wants to go see the Braves. So that's the first thing everybody asks to go see. We have a new stadium just a few years ago that was built. It's just amazing. So that's probably where I take you. But I really like where I live. I live in kind of like horse country, equestrian, all these horse farms. And I think it's just beautiful out here. I would probably take you on a little tour of this area as well.
Julane, tell me about what you are passionate about, your family, and anything else that you like to do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I have a very big family. I'm very fortunate that my parents live right here locally, and my sisters lived both in Florida, but one just moved to Texas. So she's a little bit further away, but we are all really close. And then I have a sister-in-law, two more sister-in-laws. So it's just a big extended family. And some of my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, and brother-in-law live here as well. So we do a lot with family and my kids are kind of used to that and that's really fun for all of us.
And you have two twin boys, right?
I do. I have twin boys. They are 16. They are both driving. It's a whole new season of life for sure for us.
What is something about parenting that, you wish you would have known and now like having that 2020 vision, you're like, yeah, this is one thing I'd love to share with parents?
That is a great question. I think enjoying those younger years for sure. And I think people tried to tell me that the days are long, but the years are short. And I know I've heard that 100 times, but I really don't think that ever applied when they were little. But now that they're 16 and I'm just seeing like, we only have 2 more years before they leave for college and I'm feeling this panic. Like, have I done it all right? Did I raise them the way I was supposed to raise them? Have I taught them character? And are they going to go out in the world and be productive citizens? But yeah, just enjoying the moments of those small little moments together when they're younger. I wish I would have done a little bit more of that.
I mean, the good thing, I always tell this to young parents or new parents. I mean, I'm still technically young parents. We have a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old, is that nobody has the answers, just like our own faith. Like it's just a journey as we continue on and we learn. I tell that to our kids all the time. We're like, listen, this is my first time ever doing this. So I'm trying to be the best parent I can be. So yeah, that's great. Yeah. So Julane, I know there is a lot of your story connected to how you became an author and why speaking is important to you. So I guess let's start right off with what is one of the parable stories that you wanted to share today, and then we'll get into some other questions.
So in order to really tell my parable story, which I have titled Turning Pain into Purpose, I really kind of have to back up a little bit and tell you a little background before I became an author. And music has really been a part of my life since I was a little girl. I used to stand in the family room in front of the television, basically block the TV from everybody so I could sing. And I would hold a brush up to my mouth and that was my microphone. And I really don't think that my family appreciated it all that much. So by the time I was in high school, I came home and told my parents that I was going to be in a pageant and that singing was going to be my talent. And I remember my mom saying, I didn't know you could sing. And I was like, wait, what? Like all those times I sang in the shower and in the car, you didn't know I could sing. And that's still small way, I think she meant well. Anyway, they saw some purpose and some talent, and I did not win the pageant, but I did go on to pursue music. I joined a group at school and auditioned for an international singing tour. And then later I did college singing and dancing and performing and community theater after college. So really big, important part of my life. But throughout the years, I kind of struggled with vocal loss and hoarseness. After I got married, I decided, I would kind of do that later and go back to it. I continued singing a little bit, but we really wanted kids. And that is something that did not happen overnight for us. We waited a very long time. So when I found out that I was pregnant with twins, as overwhelming as that was, I think we were just so thankful that I was pregnant, that we could have kids. And so that was something that was just really exciting. I had a lot of trouble during my pregnancy. I had to go on bed rest. And so by the time the twins were born, they were born healthy. And both of them came home with us right away. And it was just a really nice time. So I do remember thinking, okay, now that I'm a mom and I'm going to stay home, I quit my job to stay home with them, I'll get back to singing later, and that can just be something, that I'll do later. But when they were about 2, I distinctly remember, it seemed like everywhere I went, everybody had babies, and a lot of my friends were getting pregnant, and I kind of got that itch, like, I think I want another baby. And it was my husband that kind of said, yeah, I don't really think that's a good idea because of all the complications I'd had getting pregnant the first time and then carrying the twins to full term. Sorry, they weren't born full term, but just trying to do that. The doctors really advised me not to get pregnant again. And I just remember grieving that. Like, that felt like a loss to me that I couldn't have more kids. So I was having one of those, heart to hearts with God where pretty much I tell him how bad I have it. And he pretty much reminds me how good I have it and how much he's blessed me. And it wasn't an audible voice. Like, that doesn't really happen for me. But I really remember having this moment where I knew that God was speaking to my heart. And he reminded me that I've blessed you with 2 children, and I want you to raise them to become men after God's own heart. And that phrase was very specific and very clear. And I recognized immediately what that was. It was a reference to King David in the Bible. And that David made a ton of mistakes. He was not perfect, but God loved him. And he loved God with all of his heart, with all of his strength, and with all of his might. And I think that was supposed to be encouraging when God shared that with me, but I felt so overwhelmed and so inadequate. And I remember just telling God, you have the wrong mom. And just the inadequacy just overwhelmed me. But, here's the thing. When God calls us to something, he's already pre-screened us. Like, it's not a matter of us figuring out whether we're qualified. God has already qualified us. He knows that we can do what he's called us to do. And so this was a time for me to just join in God's plan and to just walk alongside what God had already put in motion.
Julane, tell me a little bit about what it was like having those complications, having that grief, because I think when we have these ideas in mind, this timeline or what we envision for our lives, and either God closes the door or it just doesn't happen in what we imagine is the perfect timeline. What did that do for your relationship with God? There's the idea of having grief, but also just like being like hurt, be like, why are you doing this to me? What were you feeling like?
Yeah, I was thinking about it today, and I was thinking how grateful I am that God does not judge us when we question him. Because I do that a lot. I question his timing. I question his blessings. And so it really was a grieving time for me that this was, not part of God's plan, but it was, I thought it was my plan. I thought it was what I wanted. And that's when I think when God really just showed me that I've already blessed you and you can do this because I'm calling you to raise these boys. And I will do that. I mean, I don't think that was like an overnight, okay, I got it. But it just began to sink in. And eventually I think I overcame some of that and realized I had opportunity here, that this was a place that God was calling me to.
I think that's so good. And that's what I think about for parable stories is that we have to take that time to reflect back. And when we think like, oh, this was not the best timing, you're like, okay, yeah, I see it now. I see it now. And I know that you are God. So after you had your sons, I know that music was such an important part. What happened to your voice and your trajectory of what you wanted to do after you became a mom?
So fast forward 1 year, the boys are now 3, and I got really sick. And due to a medication I was on and having bronchitis and just coughing, I lost my voice. And I tried all the tricks of the trade I had learned as a singer and a performer, but this time my voice didn't come back. And so it didn't come back for 6 weeks. So I have 3-year-old twins that are running out in the street, and they did not stay together. Like one would go left and one would go right. And I would try to chase them and I could not call out to them and I couldn't yell to them. So it was a very, very difficult time. And I remember something today as I was thinking back on this journey that I used to pray with my boys when they were little. I would pray for them out loud at bedtime. Well, when I lost my voice, I couldn't speak anymore. So that's the time that I taught them to pray. And I had forgotten that. I'd forgotten kind of why I taught them to pray out loud, but I would give them like a little story starter. And I would say, okay, dear Jesus, today I thank you for, and then I would say, what do you want to thank Jesus for? And then they would answer. And so in that time of 6 weeks, my children learned to pray out loud. And I don't think I realized that's why I was doing it, but it was just kind of one of those things, again, like you said, when you look back and you think of God's timing, I don't think that was accidental. Anyway, so then back to my voice. So I had gone to like every specialist. I had gone to multiple doctors. Nobody could really figure out what was wrong. Ultimately, the result was that my voice loss was permanent and that I would never sing again. So here we are again now in another step of grieving the loss, grieving, what is your plan? Because this was not my plan and I don't understand. Eventually, my voice did come back, but it never really kind of came back the same way. But because I couldn't sing, and I used to write music, but it was really more just for me. Like I never wrote professionally, but I would write songs just for me. And those songs became blogs. And I started blogging really just my journey and my frustration, and getting things out in a creative way was really helping me. I know a lot of people journal. My journal was just a little more public. It was on the internet. And years before that, I started writing a book, but really put it on hold and didn't think much about it, and decided during that time that I would pick that back up again. Now, again, I wasn't thinking writing a book for a career. I was just really doing it as more of a journal exercise, I guess, for me. But those creative thoughts turned into a book, and I wrote a novel, and then I wrote a second novel a few months later. After when my first book was published, my husband and I were having a conversation about marketing and how to market the book. And I very distinctly remember him coming to me and saying, I think that God wants you to speak to students about your book. I was like, wait a minute. No, like I lost my voice. You hear this? It's very raspy. This is not a voice that people are going to want to listen to. And he said, I just really think that that's what you're supposed to do. And I don't know if like he heard a word from God or what, but it just was very powerful. And I thought, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. So I started contacting a few schools, and they're like, yeah, we would love for you to come and speak. And I started off speaking for free, and that has grown tremendously. And especially before COVID shut everything down and the schools were allowing visitors, I was speaking on a very regular basis to students about my books, about writing. And my story really came out through those speaking, because one of the things that I teach students is to never give up, because we really don't know what God has for us us. We don't know the plan. And if we give up, we will never know. So I just tell them, don't give up. No matter on what your dream is or what you think is happening, keep on trying because there may be something really great right around the corner.
I remember when I was a little kid, there was a couple people that came in to do presentations. And I always loved that because it was just out of the normal everyday class schedule. But there was one of our local pastors who came and he gave a message. And I don't think he shared anything about Jesus, but you did have the opportunity to come back. And he always has a special place in my heart. And I just think that that's so cool that you were able to go and like speak to kids, speak to a generation that who knows what kind of family life they have at home, where people aren't speaking truth and love and encouraging them to go after their dreams. So what's something that you have seen out of that? Not even, maybe it's just something that you've grown in personally, but what God has just shown you from getting into school systems and talking to kids.
It's been amazing because I speak primarily in public schools and my books are, I call them seeker books because they're really about faith, but they're not Christian. And I have seen amazing things happen with these books and getting into public schools. My books are in hundreds of public school libraries and they really teach kids about faith, about family, forgiveness. And those are the themes of my books, and that God has used that platform of speaking to reach kids who may otherwise never hear the name of Jesus. And I think we forget that sometimes, that we really live by our example, that we don't have to speak Jesus, that people see by our lives and how we live and the words that we use. In my case, my written words, people see Jesus. And I have kids come up to me all the time and just share their stories with me. It's been amazing. Your books inspired me to become a writer, and you said something about never giving up, and I decided to try again. And it's just been incredible.
Well, what was it like, though, to just when your husband, I love that your husband, first of all, encouraged you. I think it is so important, whether you are married or not, like that we be people that encourage and see those things in others and just excite them to the possibility of what God can do in their life. Because I think sometimes when we look at ourselves, we're like, are you sure? Like, can I do? I thought the exact same thing with this podcast, but my husband did the same thing. He's like, I know you can do this. And so what was it like kind of just like stepping out for that first time and just calling that first school?
What's crazy is the very first school I ever spoke at was my kids' middle school. And I think my kids were going to die. We were in sixth grade and they were like, Mom, don't come to my school. And they sat in the back row like this, like they were so embarrassed. But I knew a lot of the teachers there and I just had, a lot of connections and I knew so many of the kids. So it was just a real personal sharing my story and how I became an author and everything back then when I first started. And then I really developed a curriculum based on going into these schools and kind of what the need was. And the need was not just to talk about books, but to talk about writing and the whole writing process. And so my curriculum meets the standards of the schools. We call them Georgia Standards of Excellence. I really try to focus on those. And so the teachers know when I come that the kids are getting a learning and an educational event. It's been good. It's really developed over time, though.
That's good to remember. Like things develop over time, and kind of going back to what you said, like how is God going to be using this from the time that, you were trying to have children to when God's saying, no, not anymore, to losing your voice. I mean, this all becomes a part of that creative process of how God is going to use that for his glory and beyond. So that's amazing, Julane. You said that like that creative process started early on for you when you had your sons. What was that like? How did you start writing? How did you choose to write fiction books for kids? Or is that just something that has always been on your heart?
No, it has not always been on my heart. Like a lot of writers, I think most writers will say, "Oh, I've always wanted to be a writer since I was a little kid." And this is part of my story I share very openly with students. Like, I was not a good reader or writer as a kid. I did not like to read. My mom would read to us, and that was always like something that was very important to her, but I was never very good at it. And reading was hard for me. I was a very slow reader. I still am, really. And so when I was in graduate school, I had a professor. I wrote my dissertation, and my professor actually was the one who called me aside and told me that he thought I was a really good writer and he wanted me to pursue a PhD, in which I said, no, thank you. I'm done. I don't want to do anymore. I'll just take my master's. But he spoke something into my life. You know, to this day, I have no idea if he was a Christian man or not, but it didn't matter. He spoke courage and boldness into my life and gave me an idea. So when I was first married, before we had kids, during that waiting period, I was writing a book, and it is tucked away in a back drawer somewhere where no one could ever find it because it was a romance novel and it was awful. I am not a romance writer for sure, but I don't know. I just wanted to start writing and just see what happened. And so then later, you know, when I really did get serious after I couldn't sing anymore and I wanted to turn some creativity into something, I started writing this book, and I really didn't know, I think at the time it was going to be a children's book. I just had an inspiration, and I met a lady who was a twin, and she had several brothers and sisters that were twins. Her mom had like 4 sets of twins, like, oh my gosh, kind of thing. No way. I only had one, but she shared her stories with me, and it inspired my first book. So, and because I had twins and everything, that was sort of the inspiration behind the book and kind of how it all started.
What would you say, Julane, for those people who feel like they're in a season that you felt like before, where you're just kind of like, how is this happening? What would be like 2 or 3 things that you would encourage them either to do or to just process through this time?
Well, the biggest thing I think I've learned is that God has a plan and we're part of it, but it may not be our plan. So during that season of question, it's okay to question. And I think God is very, very gracious when we question his timing and when we question his plan. But don't lose sight of what God may be doing on the side that we may not be able to see. A lot of times I like to say we look down in our pain, like we're looking down and all we see is just this tiny little dot. Because our focus becomes looking at our pain. And instead, I think to look forward and see what God has, you know, that there may be a different plan. If our focus and our eyes are on God and what he's going to do, I just think we lose focus when we're in that pain. I know I do. So looking back, you know, I can see all the steps. I can see that, you know, I didn't have a voice and I taught my children to pray out loud. I didn't have a voice. And then I wrote books. I became an author. I became a speaker. I have a whole new career that I never would have had my plan been put in place. And it's so much better and it's so much more fulfilling than what I'm doing now. It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting how you keep using the word voice. And I think like, you know, we think of like projecting our voice outward, but really sometimes we just need to hear the voice of God. And that is really an inward process where, you know, sometimes I do wish the same thing, like God would just talk to me audibly, but he doesn't. And so, yeah, it's just an interesting concept to think about, like how many voices we listen to in our life that really we shouldn't even be listening to in the first place. And that's great. So why don't you tell me a little bit about one of the books that has really made an impact or just really like had a special place in your heart recently?
Well, I could tell you the book that really impacted me. I told you I wasn't a good reader. And in high school, my mom gave me a book by Catherine Marshall. And it's an old book called Christy. And I'm not sure why, but I read that book and it really was inspirational. And it was probably the first book that I ever read cover to cover. And it was a book that she liked when she was younger and she thought that I would enjoy it. And, I don't know age level or anything. None of that really mattered at the time. I mean, I look back on it and I think it's just like one of those classic books that really had an impact on me. So I love inspirational stories. I love overcomer stories. I love the movie Rudy, where he's such the underdog and there's no way this kid is going to make the football team, but this kid just doesn't give up. And stories like that impact me. So anything that has inspiration or overcoming, it's kind of one of the things I think that I try to put into my own books as well.
For somebody who wants to take a step into writing or possibly just into a new part of their life that you're like, you know what, I really want to do this. What would be something that you have learned that you're like, I wish I would have known that?
Oh gosh, well, I think I did it all backwards. I wrote a book and then I said, now what? What do I do with this? I didn't know anything about the publishing world. I really didn't even know anything about the writing craft. So my first book had to be rewritten because I just didn't know. I just sat down and just wrote this book and I had to spend a lot more time editing. And so I have definitely learned things, now that I didn't know then. So I would say learning the craft of writing and just what is the current trends, what publishers and agents are looking for. Learn a little bit about all of that before you write the end on your book. It's really helpful. And then you really don't have to edit quite as much if you learn how to do everything the right way the first time.
Yeah. And I think that's great to think about. Everything is a process in our life, right? There's sometimes we need to edit. Sometimes we just need to, just throw out all the pages. But it's a process and it's not an overnight thing. And so I think that's beautiful that, you wrote that romance novel and nobody's ever going to read it. But you have these other stories that you've put out into the world. And now you're showcasing that and sharing that with young students. So that's amazing, Julane. I'm just so excited for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners today about anything else that was on your heart you wanted to share today?
I probably didn't even tell you the names of my books, so it might be a good idea. My first book is called Sour Lemon and Sweet Tea, and then book 2 is called Sour Lemon Strikes Out. And a little side note behind those books, Sour Lemon and Sweet Tea are the nicknames of the twin girls in book 1. And so one of the twins, who is kind of our main character, her name is Lily Mae. She is more like the sour lemon, and her perfect twin sister, Ellie, is like sweet tea. And so those are their nicknames, and that was a very Southern title. It's Southern fiction. And so there's just a lot of humor and one-liners in there that are fun for if you're from the South, and if you're not from the South like yourself, I think kids would enjoy the books as well. They are written for middle grade, which is like kind of upper elementary to middle school. So I say 3rd grade to 7th grade is appropriate time. And I do want parents to know, and especially if you're looking for good quality books, that the books are clean. That's super important to me. The 3rd book I've written is a teenage novel. It's a suspense novel, and it is clean as well, because that's something I'm very passionate about, is getting good quality books into public school libraries. So if parents are interested, they can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, even Audible. My books are both on Audible. And so, but Sour Lemon and Sweet Tea is book 1, and Sour Lemon Strikes Out is book 2.
Was it really hard to come up with those characters, or was like your childhood?
Yeah, the characters were very easy for me. The title wasn't. The title kind of came at the end. The characters are based on the stories of that lady who was a twin and her stories, and then also my experience as being a mom raising twins. And then I incorporated a lot of my own personal childhood stories into this as well. So the story takes place in 1979, which was during a time of, oddly enough, here we are, a time of like recession and high gas prices and difficulty financially for families. And even before all this came about in our present time, I set I wrote the book a couple years ago or several years ago now. So it was just a time of childhood memory for me. And I wanted to explore what that would be like for this family who had 3 sets of twins. They had 7 children and they're living on a farm and they're trying to keep the farm afloat. And so there's a little bit of element of mystery in there too, because kids always love mystery novels as well.
That sounds super cute. I love that. And I will definitely check those books out. We have a 12-year-old, so I'm like, I think she would enjoy that. If people wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
I have a website. My website is JulaneFisher.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. So you can connect with me that way. I do have a YouTube channel, but really I just post like some of my speaking events on there as well.
Well, Julane, thank you so much for sharing about your books, but ultimately the story of how God just is working through all things, even when it's hard for us to see that. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm grateful for Julane to share about the journey she had been on and how God used that creative energy of hers. It's so amazing. All of Julane's info will be linked in the show notes at daniellezapchenk.com if you would like to connect or check out all of her books. For those of you that really want to dive into a time of reflection, here are 2 takeaway questions. Number 1, Julane talked about praying out loud. I really never thought about it, but pretty much all of my prayers are silent or on paper. So I'd love for you to take a moment to pray out loud today. Number 2, is there a passion stirring inside of you that you just haven't let out or you feel scared to? Journal about what gifts and passions you are excited about, what God has put inside your heart, and see where God is leading you. Thank you guys so much for listening. My passion is for sharing and connecting our stories so we can see God better in our own parable. If your church, women's ministry, or event is looking for a speaker, I would love to talk with you more. You can find out more information at daniellezapchenk.com. And thank you to my technical producer of a husband, Eric Zapchenk, for editing this podcast.
Don't get technical with me.
That'll do it for today. I know there's so many different podcasts out there, so thank you so much for choosing to spend it with me. That's going to do it for today. Remember, your parable showcases God turning pain into purpose. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.